Without wasting your time, we are going to share top 5 best CPU for multitasking. The product links are in the description and in first comment. The number 5 on the list is AMD Ryzen 9. AMD Ryzen 9 is built on the Zen architecture, which on a surface level may look similar to Zen. They're both after all. However, AMD has redesigned the architecture from the ground up to increase performance and efficiency to the point where it leaves no prisoners. The biggest difference in architecture from Zen to Zen 3 is that instead of having 2 core complexes per compute die, each only has 1, with each having up to cores rather than cores on Zen. This change not only cuts down on latency when cores are communicating with each other, but it also means that each has access to a full of cache rather than being limited to of the stuff on Zen. This means that while the Ryzen has the same amount of cache as the Ryzen at each core has direct access to on the rather than on the. Because cache is so important to gaming performance, this change along with the higher clock speeds massively boosts gaming performance. In fact, as we'll explore later, AMD has boosted performance across the board here. Of course, in order to upgrade to one of these processors you'll still need to update your new motherboards will ship with a Ryzen-ready BIOS pre-installed. To be safe though, you're going to want to check to make sure the motherboard you're buying has the latest BIOS installed before you try to install it, but that compatibility goes further than just series motherboards. Certain motherboards will also support Ryzen processors like the Ryzen, though not all of them. Again, you're going to want to check the manufacturer's website to make sure the motherboard you're looking at will be compatible. If you're a new AMD user, one thing you're going to want to be aware of is how temperatures work. Rather than having one static boost target like an Intel processor, AMD Zen processors will constantly be trying to maximize performance. This means that you may see uncomfortably high temperatures, especially if you're pushing the processor hard. For instance, in our testing they reached a maximum temperature, and that's with a cooler attached. Don't worry, that's just how Ryzen is designed. AMD has told us that the new processors may peak around and that it's expected your processor isn't going to burst into flames. At the same time, Intel's processors run much cooler. In the same suite of tests with the same cooler, the Intel Core peaked at just again. This is just a difference in how these coolers are designed, but AMD's processors could lead to more hot air circulating around your case depending on the cooler you're using. On that topic, AMD isn't including a Wraith cooler in the box anymore, which means you're going to have to invest in an aftermarket cooling solution. So we'd advise going with at least a liquid CPU cooler or a thick air cooler like the opens in new tab. We focused our testing around the best PC games going this time around, as that's the core use case AMD is now championing, and with good reason. In the most CPU demanding game in our testing suite, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the AMD Ryzen beats out the Intel Core, pushing it above. However, in this test it's pretty much even with the Ryzen has a bigger departure in Total War 3 Kingdoms, however, which is a game that has always favored Intel processors. In this game, the AMD Ryzen averages at with the Ultra quality preset, beating out the Intel Core at the same resolution and quality. That's a difference there too. Moving on to pure CPU workloads, the Ryzen unsurprisingly wipes the floor with the Core multi-core workloads, but that was true of the Ryzen. However, the Ryzen in the Geekbench multi-core test is now faster than the Intel Core, up from the 11% lead enjoyed by the Ryzen in Cinebench, which simulates rendering for creative applications. The multi-core lead expands to a whopping the smallest lead in pure CPU performance comes in the Sandra CPU arithmetic test, where the Ryzen is just, but that's still a significant lead. The biggest story here is the significant jump in single-core performance, facilitated by that ground-up redesign in the Zen architecture in the Cinebench single-core test. The AMD Ryzen up from the scored by the Ryzen, a gen-on-gen increase. The Intel Core score points in this test slower than AMD. That story repeats throughout all of our synthetic single-core tests. The Intel Core slower in Cinebench, slower in Geekbench slower in Geekbench. AMD has finally claimed the single core. The number 4 on the list is AMD Ryzen Threadripper. AMD Ryzen Threadripper. Today we are looking at the most expensive desktop CPU to ever exist, and shockingly, it's not from Intel. This special occasion made us think of an Intel processor that we were quite fond of once, the Broadwell, which happened to be the first core desktop CPU when it was released. In full disclosure, while we very much enjoyed that, we didn't actually pay for it. Avoiding the hideous price tag made the product a whole lot more enjoyable for that stunning price. Intel basically tacked on 2 extra cores from the previous 2-year-old and jacked up the price. By the time they released their next core part, all bets were off as AMD had finally got their act together and had begun kicking goals with the Zen architecture. Stiff competition from the first-gen Threadripper range saw the released at, then refreshed as the and refreshed once more as a part, and the many would argue that the core part is overpriced at, and we generally agree, the point we're trying to make is a mere 4 years ago the best any high-end desktop platform had to offer was a processor that ran all cores out of the box. Today AMD is releasing a CPU with over times more cores, though it costs almost times more. The number 3 on the list is Intel Core i9. Intel Core i9 is Intel's new core desktop CPU made of silicon. Yes, of course it is. Does that mean, by extension here, and it might end up tricky to find at Intel's recommended pricing? Very possible. The demand for high-end component hardware is practically baked in these days. So the Intel's latest flagship processor and the head of its generation, Rocket Lake line, should sell well. But it is not the rabbit that the chip giant needs to pull out of its hat after a few years spent trailing AMD in CPU innovation and raw performance. It's merely a pedestrian, showing at a time when real magic is necessary to change the CPU conversation. The core, while impressive in single-threaded tasks, in our early tests ran too hot, too power-hungry and not stable enough under stress to remain competitive with AMD's Ryzen desktop CPU offerings or even Intel's own previous generation CPUs, such as the Generation Core flagship, the Core, the 8-core, slightly cheaper AMD Ryzen proves to be stiff competition for Intel on both single-core and multi-core tasks, while the cheaper Intel Core, also with 8 cores, rivaled our test sample when benchmarked in a similarly configured pre-built desktop. The slightly better single-core boost under specific thermal scenarios, which is exclusive to the Core, won't be enough to sell most buyers on this chip versus other options on the market with the same core count, though this dynamic could shift more in the Core direction as motherboards gain more stability with it over the next few weeks and months. The number 2 on the list is AMD Ryzen Thread. AMD Ryzen Thread. Now, for all the brawn and brute force that the Threadripper can exert in multi-core tests like Cinebench single-core tests remain a hurdle. Adding more cores to a package does mean that something has to give, and the clocks on a single core can take a hit. The Threadripper shares the same struggles as the rest of the company's newest chips do and will almost always lose single-core tests like this one to vastly cheaper chips like the Intel Core. Of course, using a chip like that mainly for single-core tasks is like buying a Porsche to pull hay bales. The Blender results weren't as flat-out dominant, but because the results do skew toward being so similar across a wide variety of chips, our test file doesn't take all that long to execute, taking even a second off the record. Here is a big achievement which, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, both the Threadripper and managed to do. One caveat to these impressive results is the differential we ran. The same zip test after pulling of the available ovens saw a drop of roughly % in performance. Not a 1-to-1% drop, but still something to consider if you're debating on how much to install in your system. The number 1 on the list is AMD Ryzen. AMD Ryzen. When we reviewed the Ryzen back in July at the launch of AMD's then new Zen processors, we struggled to find much wrong with what essentially was one of the best value gaming and content creation processors we'd seen to date. While that processor tailed its Intel Core competition ever so slightly in single-core tasks and scored just below excellent in gaming tests, outside of those fringe complaints, the Ryzen and the entire Ryzen line, for that matter, represented a return to greatness for a company that has spent the last decade or so living in Intel's shadow. One of the most widely used predictors of a CPU's relative performance is the Cinebench benchmark, which offers a good overview of performance on many different types of demanding apps. It's a CPU-centric test that gauges both the single-core performance and the multi-core performance of a processor when it is stressed. The resulting scores are proprietary numbers that represent the CPU's capabilities while rendering a complex image. So that just happened. Right out of the gate, the AMD Ryzen sets itself as the head honcho in the prosumer market. It bears mentioning here that Cinebench is almost by dint a synthetic benchmark. The application cinema underlying The benchmark lacks widespread, real-world adoption however, as we mentioned above, it's still a solid predictor of how a processor or system will handle an array of rendering and modeling tasks, and in this regard, the Ryzen 9 sits at the top of the pile, unmatched by even the stock results of the last